And welcome to the latest in our ongoing series of webinars for charities in the coronavirus period. We're turning our focus today to the Charity Governance Code, and specifically to the recent refresh of the code released just before Christmas, which ought to be of interest to charities of all shapes and sizes. I'm James Saunders from Kingston Smith, and joining me today are my fellow partner, Luke Holt, a charity governance specialist, and my two regular fellow panelists, Catherine Rastonji from Brown Jacobson, also a trustee at Yorkshire Cancer Research, and Charles Mosquita from Quilter Cheviot, who similarly will be talking about his experiences as a trustee at Bowel Research UK, Glasspool Charity Trust, and Prism the Gift Fund. And for the first time today, we've got a little bonus content for our viewers in this edition of our series, which we'll reveal at the end of this session. Although we can't quite stretch to an elaborate reveal with fireworks and bursts of classical music, I would recommend that you indulge us for this full 40 minutes or so, and also that you don't just skip through to the end, given, of course, this is a recorded webinar. But to start things off then, and by way of a brief background, the current edition of the code was published in November 2017. And it was always intended that there would be this light refresh in 2020, which was the reason that a consultation ran on how the code could be improved between November 2019 and February 2020. 800 respondents gave their views to the consultation. But of course, it should also be noted that the consultation predated that seismic event that is COVID-19, something that the steering group's own report does itself note. So, Catherine, if we can start on a bit of a general note, we should make it clear straight away that following or adopting the governance code is not necessarily a legal requirement, which means that there is always going to be that question about whether you treat it as prescriptive guidance or you follow a path of more pragmatic application. What are your thoughts on this, and what view have your clients taken when they've been implementing the code?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, James, because the code is a set of key principles. And I think that should be the starting point and the focal point for charities using the code. I think in some ways it's perhaps a bit too detailed. I think feedback from my clients has been the questions are too, perhaps too repetitive. You know, sometimes looking at one question and saying, well, how is that different from the one that came before it? What's the gist of this? What question are we trying to answer? I think it is forgotten. I think sometimes it's remembered at the start that it's an optional code. It isn't a legal requirement. It's not something that charities should be blindly following. But I suppose for those trustees with a particular focus on governance, wanting to do their best, I think sometimes they look at the governance code and think that it is a legal requirement, whereas the code itself is very clear that it says this is a comply or explain code. So either the provisions in it are suitable for your charity and you choose to comply with what the code says, or it's not suitable and you explain why it's not suitable in your charity or what you are doing differently that is working better for your charity rather than following the code. And that's what I'd prefer that we see more of, is that trustees have that confidence to think for themselves, that they're not just following this as rote, which I think is the risk, that every charity then starts following it blindly without thinking about whether it's suitable or not. I think some of the feedback from clients is it's too long, it's not sufficiently principles led, that perhaps it's trying to overly complicate certain themes, that could be better to focus on the theme itself rather than the individual aspects that come from it, which won't always be suitable for different charities. And I think partly that's the challenge, is that we've got such a varied charity sector that, you know, one charity does not necessarily compare to another, but the code needs to be sufficiently generic that it is suitable for all charities, rather than reading it and then switching off thinking it's not suitable for your charity. So I think some clients struggle more than others to have that direct application of the code to how their charity operates.
And what about the document, the code as a document in its own right? Do you think it's too long and too detailed? Does it have problems with not really being, you know, applicable universally?
I think possibly too long. I mean, it's very easy to criticise somebody else's hard work and to say I could have done a better code. I wouldn't be saying that, but I think in general maybe it could be more streamlined, more focus on the principle itself, and then leaving that to charities to determine how do you apply that principle to our charity, rather than trying to, cover every eventuality and be prescriptive about how it should be followed. I think possibly it could be shorter, and maybe trustees would refer to it more readily, rather than it being quite daunting and off-putting, perhaps.
Okay, thanks. And Luke, if I can come to you next and ask, what are the key areas that the consultation ended up focusing on, and do you think these were the right areas? Were there areas you expected them to focus on, and perhaps they didn't?
Thank you, James. Yes, I think just picking up on Catherine's point, there's a very good point there around each one of those principles covers 4 or 5 bullet points to begin with around key outputs, and then it goes on to the kind of principles based. There could be an argument to say that we just have those first 4 or 5 bullet points and then say to each charity, this is what I want you to get as your output, over to you to decide how to deliver it. So there might be a thought for the future there. James, coming back to your questions, I think it ties in with what Catherine's just said. The consultation, when you first read it back in early 2020, looked quite extensive. We had 15 questions there, and you thought, this doesn't feel like a small refresh, feels like 15 areas are going to change. But actually, when you read through those, it was just on 2 areas. And what we've ended up with an integrity tweak, so a few questions around safeguarding, around other areas that the sector's potentially moved on. And then the big area around diversity. I know we'll come on to speak about that later on in the webinar, but actually, if I step back and look at those 15 questions, I think they were well placed. I think there were 2 key areas where areas had moved on. The code was potentially not keeping pace with what had happened in the sector. And actually, do I stand back and think about the second part of your question? Is there anything else on those other 5 principles that they didn't ask that potentially they could have done? Back in early 2020, no, I don't think so. I think actually those 2 areas were the right ones to do, and that was the right consultation exercise.
And you say back in 2020, late 19, early 20, that would have been the question. Do you think the refresh would have been different if the consultation had been carried out post-COVID or in COVID through later 2020?
Categorically, yes. Yeah, without a doubt. The world has changed, the charity sector changed, and the risk register thoughts that charities were having, and just one day from the next has categorically changed. But I think you would have run the risk of, if it had been done during the COVID pandemic or post-COVID, it wasn't going to be a light refresh. And that is what they wanted this consultation to be. It would have covered all of those areas that I've just spoken about. And actually, this is my second time with the Court Achieve It webinar. I was your special guest back during the COVID pandemic when we spoke about governance considerations that were happening at that time, back in March, back in April. We spoke about things around risk registers, around emergency decision making, and around future strategies for charities. Each of those have their own special place in the code. Do I think that we should have looked at those during the consultation? No. I do think there's an argument that 2023 or beyond, they are going to need to be thinking about. But again, we're moving away from that light touch to a full review. So I come back to, yes, it would have been different, but I think actually where we've got to now, we're not tearing up previous reviews under the code. Those are still absolutely correctly done. And now we're just looking at 2 slight changes. And I think that's a good, or the best place that we can expect to be at this point. Okay,
and the responses to the original consultation, how representative of the sector do you feel those were once they were published?
Difficult one, and it's the virtue of any consultation. You get people with strong opinions who respond to those consultations. If I'm sitting there going, the code's okay, I know about it, potentially I'm not going to feed back to that consultation because my thoughts aren't at one strong end of the spectrum. I think we had upwards of 800 responses, the steering group said, and actually it was quite a good spread between the larger charities of the world, not the behemoths, but the bigger ones, kind of 5 million and above. And the Small Charities Coalition, SCC, pushed it quite heavily to the smaller charities. So we've got a good spread there, but I think there's a bigger point here. 800 respondents is great, but actually I think it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy here that the people that responded are those that are aware of the code, have done something to do with the code, and already talk about it in their financial statements. I don't know the answer, but where I think I'd love to get to is, how do we get to others that didn't even know about the code, let alone the consultation? Those are those where, if we start talking to people about the Charity Governance Code, governance in the sector is just going to improve. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I prefer we'd had. So, yeah, I do think it's representative. I wished it was 8,000, not 800. But how we get there in the future, I'm not quite sure yet.
Okay, thanks. Charles, turning to you, are you intending to do a review of any of your charity's governance using the refreshed code?
Short answer is no, because I think, well, the two areas that came under scrutiny, the ethics and diversity, were well flagged, and we were already reviewing our approaches in the various organisations that I'm involved with. So, to me, there is nothing that's come out of the refresh that has surprised me. And in fact, going back to Luke's comment about the number of people who've responded to the consultation, I mean, I think 800 is a pretty good number in the first instance. But you sort of slightly wonder why you're having a refresh 3 years down. I mean, I can understand having a review of it, but it takes time for these things to sort of embed into the charity sector and everybody getting used to it. And I suspect more people are using it than is the general perception of what is going on. How they're using it is different, but I mean, my approach to these things is always that, whenever you do something within an organisation, it's got to have a practical outcome. It can't be just for a tick box exercise.
Do you think the governance code has had a positive impact on the sector since it was introduced, though, even if the refresh is only a stage along that path?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, talking to trustees about it, I think they've found it as a very useful tool to go through and review what they're doing. Before the code was introduced, I think a lot of us just made assumptions that things were happening without actually discussing it and debating it. And I suppose a really good example of that would be what came out of the fundraising scandal. As a trustee, with BAL Research UK, where all of our revenue comes from fundraising, I think as a trustee, I just assumed that my values, principles, and what I thought were the ethical bits that we should be doing within an organisation, everybody else was thinking the same, and we were acting in the same basis. But we had never sat down and discussed it. And actually, when we did, of course, yes, there is a high commonality across it. But I think what the code does allow you to do, or ensures you're doing, is actually open up that debate and let that happen. So I think it's had a massive impact. And the other thing, I think it was also a very natural transition, because we've seen a sort of 20-30 year, over the last 20-30 years, where there's been a massive professionalisation of the employees in the sector. And you just look at things like CFG and Akivo and everything else of what they've done. And I think that trustees had sort of a little bit been left behind. And I think this has been a great catalyst of moving that forward. I use the word professionalisation as in a quite a sensitive way, because you don't want it to become a profession. But what it does allow is the people to have a really good understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Getting back to the actual refresh then, one of the first points in the steering group's original report was that there was an immediate and quite stark disparity between the positivity of responses in the consultation and those in response to an equivalent small charities coalition survey, where respondents were notably somewhat less positive about the code. The steering group therefore did note that one of its aims would be to try and make the code more applicable to smaller charities. It notes in particular volunteer-led and volunteer-run organisations. But the refresh didn't in the end seem to address this in any great way. And although the code is obviously split into two versions for large and small charities, it does really remain generally the same code with some words changed in there. Charles, playing devil's advocate here a bit, you're a trustee of three charities of different sizes. Would you want to have different codes which allowed one of your charities to have, substantially different governance standards to others, and by extension to other much larger or indeed much smaller organisations?
Absolutely not. I think if you want people to follow the code, you want them to use it, and you've got to keep it you know, simple, and you have got as simple as possible, accepting what Catherine has said, that these things are not easy to put together or to design. But the more complexity you put in it and the more differences in the different codes, you know, people will get confused about what they should and shouldn't use. So, you know, when they came out with two codes, I mean, I read the large and the smaller one, and I couldn't really see much difference between the two. You know, the problem that with the charity code has is it is covering a very broad spectrum of organisations, both in size and activity and everything else, and it just has to accept that. But in certain ways, that's actually probably quite a good thing, because it then makes the committee or the steering group have to be quite disciplined in the way that they formulate the code and publish it. And I think one of the big dangers is that each time we have a review, it just gets longer and longer, and it becomes War and Peace, and then people will use it less so. And to me, the guiding principles really should be applied to all organisations, irrespective of the side. And actually, taking a little bit from Luke was saying about, you know, if it had been done post-pandemic, would it be different? Well, actually, fundamentally, the principles shouldn't be. Yes, there will be issues that we may not have thought about, but actually, the fundamental principles, to my mind, would stay the same. I think there might be a justification to have one for organisations that don't have employees versus the ones that do, but even there, I still think, you know, I look at my local village hall and playing fields where, you know, the turnover is about £5,000 a year. You know, they're all volunteers and everything else, but actually the fundamental principles of the code apply to them equally as it does for a charity with a turnover of 1 million, 10 million, or 20 or 30 million. It's just the complexity of the organisation is different. So I'm not a fan of two codes, and I remain an advocate that we should just keep it to one and keep it as simple as it is possible to do so without losing the purpose.
Catherine, I mean, given there was this stated, you know, aspiration, if you like, in the steering group's report, can you see any ways in which the code could deal with smaller charities differently without that accusation being levelled that it's watering down its objectives or its recommendations?
Yeah, I suppose similar to the point I've already made, I think if it was focusing more on the principles, and maybe as Lucas said, if it was the principles plus the outcomes, that would be enough. And also I think just maybe more of a reminder throughout that if something isn't applicable to your charity, then don't apply it to your charity, to almost to have that confidence. And I think for small charities, it may be an issue about they haven't got employees, but I also think the sections in there about whether your charity is a membership charity. Not all charities are, so that won't necessarily be relevant. Same with if you haven't got volunteers, then issues around how you interact with your volunteers won't be relevant either. So I think rather than watering it down, I think if we rose up to more of a principles and outcomes level, then small charities could interpret those principles into how they apply to their situation, and it could still be relevant rather than it being watered down. And I think, as we've commented on before, the difference between the code and the code for small charities is minimal, I think, to our reading. So I don't necessarily think it's helpful to have a separate code for small charities. I think have a code that every user can interpret for themselves.
Okay, thanks. Luke, is there any argument that if you're dividing the code into subsections based on size, or you could also or should also be looking at dividing it into sectors or activity or any other differentiators of some sort, given how diverse charities are and, as Charles said, how wide the sector is, how much it catches?
I think the last 5 minutes in particular around this important part of charity governance, and also an interesting part. There's a few key points that I would expect the webinar and watchers to take away. I was quite prevalent and quite outspoken in the sector when those two codes came out. As we've all said, as Catherine and Charles said, I know why the steering group did it. I know why Rosie thought that was a good idea. And they used the £1 million, which was the new charity audit threshold, for the difference. I still think, and I'm very strong in the opinion of, that level's wrong. I think there's not that much difference between a £900,000 charity and a £2 million charity. That's why we get to those two codes of the 6 or 7 differences. They're nuances. They're not two different codes. Do I think we shouldn't have two different codes? I think that's an interesting point. Something your webinar watchers might want to look at is the NCBA's micro charity code. It's not another code, but it is an aspirations of something Charles mentioned around a real differentiator can be when you have no employees. Suddenly trustees are having some difficult governance discussions around wearing two hats. Am I making this decision as an employee, or am I making this decision as a trustee? That's a really good kind of dissemination down of the Charity Governance Code for a smaller version. Yes, it's something else that trustees have to look at, but I wonder whether that's a direction of travel for the Charity Governance Code. And picking up on something that Catherine said, we've got this theme around principles based, let's not put too much information into the code. And James, you and I are audit partners as well as governance specialists. Using the SORP as an example, when that went from 2 SORPs from the FRISI and FRS 102 SORP to just 1, they moved it to a kind of modular basis. So I remember the first time we logged in, you had a list of questions of what size charity are you? Do you fundraise? Do you have grants? Do you have employees? And by ticking those boxes, providing you knew the right answer, you built a bit more of a bespoke SORP for yourself. A 600-page document suddenly became 15 pages or 25 pages. I wonder whether there's an argument for that for the Charity Governance Code going forward. If you fundraise, you should think about doing this. If you're a granting charity, you should think about doing this. It doesn't change governance as such, but it makes it a bit more bespoke, and it makes that document far more readable. And I think my last point is the steering group have also signposted that they're aware of this. Your point, James, on question to me around other codes. We have got them. We've got the NHF code for housing. We've got a sports governance code. There's other bits and pieces in the background. There's always going to be those documents, but I think Rosie in particular, Rosie Chapman, has been very specific in saying, we know that not all charities are the same. We're going to try and share some more guidance with you, maybe inside the code, maybe outside, to just try and arrow this towards making it specific for you. So I'd love to return to this point. I think we've come up with some great ideas here. It'd be interesting to see where the Charity Governance Code goes in the future.
Super, yeah, thanks, Luke. Turning slightly, the refresh also covered the issue of ethics, as we mentioned earlier. I think it's fair to say that this subject is invariably referred to as thorny in whatever context it arises. And it does seem that the responses in the consultation were quite varied. Luke, coming back to you, the consultation report did look at the possibility of including the NCBA's charity ethical principles in the code in some way. How much has actually been brought into the refresh code, and how effective do you think that change will be?
Yeah, great question, James, and moving to that kind of integrity refresh, as they've called it, rather than a full rewrite. The main signpost around ethics and safeguarding was those NCBA principles. Back in the start of 2019, it was a document that was released. And actually there's an enormous amount of crossover in the code there. What are the 4 principles? The right to be safe, i.e. safeguarding. Beneficiaries first, that's the public benefit principle that we all live and work by in the charity sector. And then integrity and openness. Those are 2 of the principles already in the code. So I think from that part, when I read that in the consultation, I had a concern of, are we going to have this as an appendix and suddenly the document is 6 pages longer? Are we going to have this reworked into the code? The same reason, we're going to have a much larger document. How are they going to cross-reference it? Personal opinion is I think we've got to quite a good happy medium. Yes, it's another document that you've got to look at, but the code now just says, have due regard to other codes and sector information, which may be helpful alongside the Charity Governance Code. So you've got to have 2 or 3 documents in front of you, but I think we've indicated that there could be other information out there, and we've put the NCBA principles in there without actually increasing the size of the code. So a good happy medium, in my opinion. Good.
Yeah. Charles, turning to you, is there anything from what Luke has said or anything that occurs to you about this ethical question which gives you concern as a charity trustee at all?
I'm afraid I'm going to disagree here with Luke, because I always thought at the time, I mean, the NCBA's review, or when they came out and published it, was in response to safeguarding. And I always thought that it should have been in the domain of the governance code anyway. And I never really understood why it wasn't there. I personally wanted that to be incorporated into the governance code in whatever format. It doesn't really matter. I didn't want it to be referred to another document, because I just think, again, think about the trustees are volunteers. You want to make things as easy as possible for them. So why are we referring to another code? I would have liked to have seen it. I think that would have been a simple thing to have done. And I think that NCBA, in fact, I thought had done a very good job with the ethics code, and I think that would have been quite an easy for them to have incorporated in. But that's just my opinion on it.
And we've seen more media coverage recently about reported bad behaviour and conduct of both management teams and trustees. Charles, do you think that the code has helped efforts to reduce the types of behaviour that we want to see less of? And if the NCBA code is taken alongside the governance code, will that help? Will that achieve that objective?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it that the code has helped reduce bad behaviour. I mean, it's not going to stop it. Unfortunately, we're an imperfect world, and in fact, I think charities should be applauded for the way that they respond to when issues arise. Because I haven't met an organisation yet that wants to do the right thing. Or doesn't want to do the right thing, in putting it that way. But actually, what the code I think has done, it was interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's just become a new trustee, and he's used the organisation he was with, there were some things that were concerning him. I'm not hugely radical or whatever, but he was able to use the code as to start the conversation. And what it did, in fact, was allow him to depersonalize some issues, but actually address some fundamental problems within an organisation. And to me, going back to, Rosie Chapman and the steering group, I think they have done a fantastic job, and I think they should really be applauded for putting the code together in the first place. I mean, yeah, it's not perfect, and yes, it will evolve, but I think they should take great credit that actually the code definitely has helped organisations and people within it, whether they're trustees or members of staff, be much more open, use it as a tool to speak out and to challenge, and to do it in a way that they don't need to be feeling that they're doing it personally. They can actually use the code and the principles to enact that. So to my mind, I think it has been been a beneficiary impact, and I would expect that just to continue as more and more people adopt it and use it in that way.
Okay, and the next interesting aspect of the refresh starts to move into those questions of diversity and equality, as we mentioned earlier. Again, I think we were all expecting these questions will be covered to a much greater extent in this refresh, however light it was intended to be, given the massive and very public impact that Black Lives Matter in particular has had in this last calendar year through 2020 and earlier. Catherine, Rosie Chapman in a recent blog said that typical feedback in the consultation was that diversity is the one single area that's moved on the furthest since 2017, and will be the area of the code that would benefit most from a full review and update. So what developments and changes have been introduced into the refreshed code on diversity and equality?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general terms, the revised code is much more about the practical application of diversity and inclusion. So rather than just being seen to be doing it and ticking boxes, it actually wants to have an outcome and an action from it. I think the change of language is interesting. So the previous version would talk about promotes the charity's reputation and seen to be acting with integrity, whereas the new version says promotes the charity's reputation by living its values, and the board acts in the best interest of the charity's purposes and its beneficiaries, creating a safe, respectful and welcoming environment for those who come into contact with it. So I think we can see from that change of language, there's much more of a positive obligation to actually be doing this rather than just talking about it. And previously the guidance said that inclusive and accessible participation was to be encouraged. But now I think, again, it seems to go further than that by assessing the systems and culture that actually allows for that participation to be possible and for it to be authentic participation. So we're not just doing this to score points, but it doesn't really work on a practical level. It's got to be embedded for those changes to improve. And I think finally, there's more accountability for diverse recruitment. So guidance has been added about having targets and plans for how to reach those targets. So I think we've talked about this for a long time, that the charity sector is not diverse. I think there's a discussion about what we mean by that term, but I think the code is trying to create more of that positive obligation that we actually need to start addressing this rather than just labelling it as a problem but not really tackling it head on.
Okay, and I understand that some of the feedback during the consultation process led to a discussion around whether the word used should be equality or whether it should be something like equity. Is that an important or helpful distinction?
I fear that may have been lawyers that said those things. That sounds like a lawyerly thing to say, that rather than talk about the issue, let's talk about the terminology that we use. So personally, and shocking, Charles. So as much as I don't want to turn on my own kin, I think personally the label is not what's important. I think I could understand why it was being raised as an issue. So do we treat everybody equally or do we treat everybody fairly? So that was why that language was being discussed, as which one should we use. But I think diversity and inclusion is more of a focus in the private sector. I think that is the terminology that's understood. And I think it is an area that the charity sector needs to be looking at. And diversity and inclusion, to my mind, gives the label, says what it does on the tin, is what we should be looking at, rather than going down this track of, is it equality, is it equity?
Okay, yeah. Luke, how can the refreshed code, the original code, help trustees get ahead of the curve and be proactive on this subject rather than just being reactive or simply ticking the boxes, however important those boxes might be?
I think Catherine's touched on exactly the right points around, frankly, what's the point in just doing a diversity tick box exercise? There's almost no point in doing that anyway. You don't achieve anything. Actually, you don't meet the principles of the code if you're ticking those and not actually thinking about the background. I always come back to, with our more Kingston Smith clients, what does diversity mean for you? What does it mean for your organisation? And actually why we're pushing this, why we're thinking it's important in the sector, is around the feedback, the reviews that have been done in the sector, that diverse boards make better decisions. So what don't you have on your board? How would you like to get there? And what's the direction of travel? I do think the refreshed part of the code there is a brilliant new example, a kind of blueprint for charities that thought, I want to do this, but I'm not quite sure I know how to. And the feedback that you said, James, in your quotes that Rosie Chapman made, actually that's my quote on behalf of More Kingston Smith to the consultation, absolutely word for word. I felt the diversity principle was showing its age in the 2017 version. I think this 2020 reworked version, and it's a full rework rather than a refresh, it is what we needed. I touched on clients that we've worked with. I think talking to trustees and having honest conversations, they felt two things. One was, it's an area where we, us as a charity board don't want to say the wrong thing. We're aware of diversity. We want to do the right part. Coming back to Charles' point of, you've never met a trustee board that doesn't want to do the right thing. And also they didn't know how to work that through. Example that comes into my mind is my audit portfolio. I work with a lot of NHS charities. They'll sit there as a trustee board and go, well, what do we want to do? Do we want to reflect our trustee board of everyone that could ever access the NHS? Do we want to reflect our board of the people that work with our NHS trust? Or do we want to think about, we're a specific eye hospital or we're a specific lung hospital? Is that the kind of diversity? Or is it back to just diversity of thought and we want a mixture across the board? Those are all interesting questions and I'd love to give you the answer for each one of them. The answer at the moment is it depends. So it comes back to Catherine's point of, don't just do a tick box exercise. Use this reworked example in the code. Yes, it's longer. Yes, there's more there, but I think it's a brilliant version to actually give you a blueprint to travel. And without sounding like a broken record, I come back to that word aspirational. If you go through it and you go, well, we're not doing that, cross, we're not doing that, cross, that's not the end of the journey. That is an aspiration to, well, why aren't we doing it? Do we want to? And if we do, how do we get from a cross to a tick? That's how I'd love our clients and the rest of the charity sector to be working with this around diversity and equality and inclusion.
James, can I? So I'm sorry. I'm going to just because I just wanted to add something here because I think this is really important, isn't it? It's because it's not diversity for diversity's sake. It's what you're wanting to do is to improve the decision making because you've got more diversity of thought and background. And I think we talk about the communities we serve and how do we represent them and so that we understand them. And And I think there are many ways in which boards can have more diverse boards without going through this sort of tick box exercise of have we done, and it's very much so predicated around the sort of the skills audit and what you need on a board. And to give you an example, one of the areas was whether young people were being trustees. And I remember going out and having conversation with a number of people in their 20s and saying, are you interested in? And the answer was universally yes, of volunteering and being a trustee. But the one thing they were fearful of was actually what the responsibility of being a trustee was. So with two of them at Glassball, we've had them as shadow trustees, and it's absolutely brilliant. So they've had all the papers, they've been involved in all the meetings, the discussions and everything, and they've been actively encouraged. In fact, on occasions I've completely forgotten they weren't trustees, but they've never had a legal responsibility. And in fact, one of them has become a trustee, and she's absolutely brilliant. So I think people just need to be creative in their thought process of how they go and find a more diverse group of people. And it's not as necessarily as difficult as one might think.
So Charles, since you've got your soapbox out, and in the full knowledge this is one of your absolute favourite subjects to argue with anyone about, there is the perpetual argument that the paying trustees would help diversity, in as much as it would prevent trusteeship being largely the preserve of the retired or the wealthy, and increase the chance of the time poor, as you mentioned, becoming trustees. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think it'd be fantastic paying trustees. I could retire and just go and get a whole load of trusteeships. No, I've been very, as you well know, I've been a very strong advocate that I do not think paying trustees is the right thing. I think it would destroy the ethos of being a trustee and why people do it. There may well be very, very special circumstances where it is the right thing to do. But I think those should be really, really few and far between. If you think about why people become trustees or even just volunteer for organisations, they want to give back something to society. If you're not being paid, you're doing it from a completely selfless act for the benefit of society. And as soon as you start paying people, you will change the way that people think about the role and the responsibility. The other thing what you will also do as a consequence of it is the likelihood is that the actually will become less diverse because it'll go into a smaller pool of people. It'll become a much more formal recruitment process, and then what you'll end up is recruiting in your own image. So I think it would be an absolute disaster. I think this has been tried and tested. I think it works extraordinarily well. And yes, it can get better, and trustees can be better at what they do. But actually, I think there is a natural willingness out there because people are volunteers to do that. And the other thing I just want to pick up, because you talk about people who are retired and everything else, it really makes me angry when I hear people sort of saying there are too many people who are, pale, male and stale, like myself, who are trustees. Well, actually, no, let's applaud those people who are already giving up time, but let's encourage more to get involved from a more diversified base of doing that. And how do we do it? Rather than saying, oh, we've got too many, old male individuals who are retired above a sort of a certain ecosystem that are influencing the way things are. I think the whole thing about the code and encouraging diversity actually is a step forward. But we should still celebrate those that are there. So the simple answer is no. I think it would be really bad news for the sector to be paying. And also, I wonder if people who generously give money to charities, how they would react. I can certainly, from my perspective, if I knew, of every pound I was giving, 10p is going to go and pay for the trustees. Well, I'd be much more reluctant to give money to charity.
Okay, thanks very much. I think you can tuck your soapbox away for another week or so. Probably the last questions now, getting to the tail end of this, about the next version of the code due in 2023. The refresh contains a list of longer term issues identified for potential inclusion in that 2023 refresh, and we're just going to put them up on the screen just for 30 seconds or so now, just so you can see what they are. But for the panel, questions, 3 questions really. Which of them do you think is most likely to appear in that eventual rewrite in 2023. Which of them would you most like to see focused on? And is there anything not on the list that you'd like to see included? So, Catherine, if we can come to you first on those questions.
I think I'll go reverse order on the questions, James. I didn't necessarily spot anything that wasn't included in those suggested topics that I thought should be. I did think some of the suggested topics are more akin to detailed Charity Commission guidance than they are to a governance code. I didn't necessarily think they were appropriate or could be included in this way. I would hope that membership charities could be included. Maybe there's a separate subsection of the code specifically relating to membership charities, because I think there are quite distinct issues and sometimes problems that arise there that wouldn't apply to everybody. So I think that could be a useful way of including that. In terms of what's most likely to appear, I don't know, but I'm always interested when I don't know to then think, oh, what made it through? But I think there are some big themes here that maybe there could be more around trustee inclusion and generally the role of trustees and getting that more diverse trusteeship.
Good, thanks. Charles, in your mind?
Yeah, I agree with Catherine. I look at that list and I think a lot of it is actually the sort of the day-to-day function. It's not really, and it's been covered by the governance code in its principles. I mean, I suppose the two that really leap off the page to me is the environmental and sustainability. So being a responsible organisation, and we're certainly in the world of investment are seeing that suddenly, having thought it was going to happen 20 years ago, suddenly has been catapulted into the forefront of most people's minds. But actually, I think charities need to think more holistically in the way they are. And I'll give you a very good example. You know, at RL Gospel, we've got an endowment of 45 odd million, of which is invested. And yes, we're there for relief of poverty. So what's important to us? Well, we want to make sure that the companies we're investing in are looking after responsibly their employees, and also their supply chains, etc., that they are dealing with in an appropriate way, because we don't want to be effectively investing in organizations that are creating beneficiaries for us in simple terms. But, we give away about 7,000 grants, and it's cookers and microwaves and bedlinen and everything else, and we deal with AO and Dreams, so one of the conversations we've had with them is about their supply chain. So where are they sourcing stuff? What factories are they taking out? How do they engage with those? Because actually, it's all well and good with our investments, but it should also be of how we are behaving as an organization, goes back into ethics and culture and values and making it coming through. So I think, although it is covered in the code, I think that will definitely be an area which I think we'll have a much greater look at in 3 years' time. I would slightly question about, I think it's good to review every 3 years. But I have to say, I fear that if we went through a root and branch and a change, because I think, we need to accept that the code is being adopted. The other area which I think is really interesting, but again, not sure that it should necessarily need to be in the code, is about impact reporting and measurement. It's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And again, I suppose, to give you a good example, if you're site savers, it's quite sort of binary, isn't it? You spend a certain amount of money and you repair or save the sites of a number of people. That's a fairly easy thing to measure. With Glasspool, where we're giving away, around 2 million a year, which is a drop in the ocean, really, compared to what government spends on relief of poverty or helping people in financial hardship. But, we know that we are having a positive impact because our grants that we're giving out are they're one-off grants to individuals, and giving somebody a cooker or a washing machine, it does have a material impact on their lives and everything else. But actually, I don't think we've necessarily worked out a really good way of measuring that and being able to demonstrate that. But it's not an easy thing to do. So I suspect that will be another area that's going to have a lot of scrutiny going forward. But should it be in the governance code? Not so sure about that.
Okay, last but by no means least, Luke.
Let's save the best till last. I'll try and add a couple of additional comments, but actually just mentioning a couple of things on Catherine and Charles's comments. Impact reporting, I do think that is moving at a pace. I think it's important, and Charles explains it very eloquently. It's not easy, it's very difficult, but House of Lords a few years back said impact of a charity is its absolute empirical measure. So bringing that into the Charity Governance Code and actually saying, if you want this grant, give us the overview of what the impact's going to be, not just that you're going to spend £2 million. So I'd love to see that worked into both the SORP and the Charity Governance Code going forward. I just mentioned that word SORP. It's on there on that list that we just flagged up, that there will be, or expect there to be, a new charity accounting SORP by 2023. That will change some bits and pieces. I think it's important that it's reflected in the Charity Governance Code, but I pray that we don't get to absolutely replicating it in both areas. It doesn't need to be in both, and it's back to Charles's point of a few of these are good areas that don't need to be charity governance. So alignment of the two documents categorically, replication, no, we're just having replication for replication's sake. And then just two last comments from me, James, if I may. A couple of worrying ones in there, I suppose. Risk, independence, trustee involvement, that's in the code already. Is it people saying that they want more by 2023? We run the risk of what we've spoken about for the last 45 minutes, the code getting bigger, less workable, and less people applying it because it's a huge document. And then the final piece, Charles had his soapbox out earlier, I'm going to get mine out. It's around mandatory adoption of the code, or just the point that we spoke about of 800 is great, I want 8,000 or 80,000 applying this code. So there's the soft way to do this. Charity Commission guidance use the must, should and may terminology of must, it's a legal requirement, should or may, you've got a choice, should, we expect you to do this from a best practice point of view. I'd love to see the Charity Governance Code talked about in those sort of terms. Comply or explain, if it's legal requirement, great. If it's not, the Charity Commission expects you to adopt this, and therefore we will get an uptake. And actually we've already got that in subsectors of the charity sector already. I mentioned the NHF housing code earlier on. They've refreshed theirs, and actually they've come back to the same point of, it's not a legal requirement, but we expect you in your next set of financial statements to talk about your application of this. And if you haven't applied a certain area, we're not saying it's wrong, tell your readers and tell your stakeholders why. I don't see why the Charity Commission can't do that similarly for the charity governance, and we get to 2023 with a code where everyone goes, I want to apply this. Aspirational maybe, utopian additionally maybe, but I'd love to see us get there by 2023.
James, can I just add one thing, because I happen to be looking on the Charity Commission website and to see if I could find the governance code or any reference to it. And I went to their guides, which there are 40 of them, couldn't find a single reference to it. I find that, I know it isn't a Charity Commission document, and actually I think it's right that it shouldn't be, and I think it sits very well with the governance steering group. But you would have thought that being a charity governance code, that it should sit front and center when you type in onto Google, Charity Commission guidance for trustees, and it's not there. And I just find that absolutely bizarre. And I didn't look at Oscar, and I didn't look at the Northern Ireland Charity Commission for Northern Ireland, but I would hope that they would also have it front and center, and also to have one code across the United Kingdom. Sorry, if we're developing other codes, and I don't know whether we are, again, I just think that you are making it extremely difficult, or more difficult than it needs to be for trustees. So, if there's one piece of advice I would give to the Charity Commission possibly, is that they might want to put this document, particularly as they were involved with it and have supported it.
Excellent. On that bombshell, it's probably all we have time for today. Of course, I did promise that bonus content for the hardy viewers among you that have stuck around with us for this long. We do have a document which compares the third version versus the refreshed fourth version of the code in a type of tracked changes format. And if you are watching and you'd like a copy of that, then please do get in touch with any of us on the screen if you have a regular contact, or indeed you can email Luke, since he's the original author of the document, at lholt@mks.co.uk. Hopefully the address is on the screen, and we'll forward the document to you. So it just falls me to say thank you for joining us for this webinar on the Charity Governance Code refresh, and thank you to our panelists, Luke, to Catherine, and to Charles. Please do get in touch if anything in these sessions does ring any bells with you. Otherwise, we do hope you'll join us for our next webinar, and until then, goodbye.